So welcome to the LSE, best school in the world. The Times said again, but whatever the Times says, we definitely think it is. My name is J.P. Zigrand. I'm the co-director of the Systemic Risk Center and the director of the Financial Markets Group, which are hosting today's event. It's a pleasure to welcome you all tonight in the Malaysia Auditorium. We will be joined by a group of distinguished speakers who will share their insights on a topic that sits in the very heart of the trust in the financial system, the role of culture within financial institutions. And we look at how both prudential and conduct regulators are overcoming the challenges. First, I have to make a few compulsory announcements, as those who have been here before know. First of all, if you want to post on X, the hashtag for today's event is #LSE_SRC. The event is being recorded and will be made available as a public video subject to no technical difficulties. We also, you will have seen, have a photographer here who will capture the event, and a selection of photos will be posted on our website. If for any reason you do not want to be in the images, which may be published, please do let us know after the event. There also is no fire drill scheduled for today, so if you hear the alarm, please do leave the building following our staff. I would like to say a word about the SRC and the Financial Markets Group. So we are here to study all things that make the financial markets not work properly, that put them at risk of working properly. And that includes a long list of financial risks. And we have had many events about regulation, about market risk, but also about risk culture. I went through the past events we had in the last, 15 years. There were quite a few events we had on risk culture. Finance with sociology, with anthropology, with ethnography, with psychology, with anthropology, to go beyond process-oriented solutions and develop a forward-looking understanding. The last one was, in fact, just 2 years ago, and it came 10 years after the publication of the report by the UK Parliamentary Commission on Banking Standards. Since then, we had the ECB draft guidelines last year, and most importantly, we have the Supervisors on Supervision deeper dive that Stephen Scott will soon tell us all about. So I'll introduce my first speaker, which is Stephen Scott, founder and CEO at Starling Trust Sciences. 25 years of experience in risk management and corporate intelligence. He will speak on the report, Supervisors on Supervision, a deeper dive, which is a recent report coming out soon, curated and developed by his team, based on interviews with senior policymakers and regulators, offering a timely perspective on the subject at hand. Stephen, please do come up. You have 15 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, JP, for having me. I have to say it is something of a thrill to be back at the London School of Economics. The last time I walked these halls was a little over 30 years and half a lifetime ago. In the time since, the footprint of the school has expanded. Whether my mind has expanded in a commensurate pace is for others to decide. My waistline surely has kept up. And I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a very, very dear friend recently passed, Professor Christopher Coker, who was a professor of international relations here at the LSE. He was my mentor, probably the single most breathtaking mind I've ever had the privilege of encountering, and became a very, very dear friend to me. Christopher was a unique guy. He was a professor of war and war studies, and he emphasized that war was not just about history. It wasn't simply about remembering important dates and great battles and great generals. War, for Christopher, was a question of philosophy, the question of why war. And to answer the question, why war, he urged us to move away from the historians, from the strategists, from the game theorists, and rather to embrace the thinking of the cultural anthropologists. War was a distinctly human phenomenon, he emphasized. It was a cultural phenomenon. Now, Christopher died in a tragic accident just a couple of years ago. His last published essay, he wrote on this topic, He said that the fact that human beings are subject to cultural drivers of behavior is in fact what makes our species distinct. He wrote, "We are all social animals." And he added, "We have far more cultural instincts, as it happens, than we do biological ones." And while cultural factors lay behind our readiness to go to war, lay behind some of the greatest brutality that the species is capable of, so too did it lie behind the greatest nobility that we are capable of, which is a message of hope that I encourage us all to keep in mind. He wrote, "Darwin recognized that if natural selection works at the level of individuals genetically, we fight to survive, society works at the level of the collective. Society can turn selfish genes into selfless people." I think that's a message that's an important one for our current times. When I graduated from the LSE, I had contemplated a career in the intelligence services, and Christopher pulled me aside and said, "Well, if you want to do that sort of work, why not do it in the private sector where you can actually make a few bucks?" As a kid who put himself through school, that seemed a sensible idea. And so I joined the corporate intelligence world, lacking the obvious credential, and I spent 25 years investigating corporate malfeasance, mishap, fraud, political corruption, effectively everything that can go wrong in an organization. I worked on the ground in over 50 countries in that time. I lived and worked for many years in this country, in Germany, in Spain, in Shanghai. And what that experience taught me was that the human species is a fairly consistent organism. Our cultural differences are at the margins. At the level of our DNA, everyone in this room is fundamentally indistinguishable. Your DNA manifested slightly different than mine. And it's our cultural upbringings that really shape how we behave. But those cultural inclinations are derivative of a natural science substrate. The organism itself follows some basic rules. I do a lot of public speaking on this topic, and I usually somewhat cheekily put up a picture of Freud behind me, and I ask the question, what is the fundamental human drive? And there's usually a little bit of silence and some nervous tittering, and eventually some brave soul says, sex. And the answer is no. And then you hear power, you hear anger, you hear money, and the answer is no. The fundamental human drive is belonging. Ostracism from our peers, particularly our trusted peers, is evolutionarily terrifying. And we will do whatever it takes to keep that sense of belongingness with that group of people. And I saw that over and over again in the work that I did. I would be in the middle of an investigative interview with some important person who was a grown-up, they were accomplished, they seemed sensible, and some man or woman would be in tears across the table from me, and they'd say, "I really just don't want to be involved in this." And I would say, "I get it, I understand, but the fact that I'm sitting here across from you means you're involved. Now, you seem like your mama raised you right. Help me understand what happened. How did we get here? Why are we here?" And remarkably to me, the answer was the same. Men, women, young, old, pick your nation in the world, pick your language. The answer was the same. Any guesses what the answer was? Any brave souls? The answer was I had no choice. I had no choice. I would remind people that that argument didn't fly at Nuremberg. And when you drill down into it, what they were saying was, if I didn't go along with the behavioral norms that my peers were forcing upon me, I'd have been ostracized. And that is simply untenable. And the social science research is with me on this. We see over and over again that despite your good upbringing, when you are confronted with the fear of being ostracized, if you don't go along to get along, people capitulate and they embrace the behavior that will support their continued belonging in their peer group. Behavior, in other words, is patterned. And it occurred to me that, well, if there's patterns in behavior, then rather than call me in after things have gone sideways, is there not some way to spot signals in those patterns that allow us to operate from the front foot rather than the back foot? And around this point in time, someone described to me AI as a prediction engine. Now, I couldn't spell AI, but prediction engine sounded sensible. And so I asked myself the question, could we use AI and teach AI to think the way I think, and find some way of becoming predictive of organizational outcomes so that we can intervene proactively, engage from the front foot. And I set about trying to prove that that could be done. The punchline is it can, and it has. We call it predictive behavioral analytics. But this work was being done in 2013, which was around the time the LIBOR scandal had erupted in this country. And as JP just referenced, the Parliamentary Commission on Banking Standards did a report changing banking for good. That led to the creation of the Banking Standards Board. The former head of that is here with us tonight. Hello, Allison. Thank you for joining. And the Banking Standards Boards and others started talking about culture as a thing of some supervisory significance. In 2014, Bill Dudley, the president of the New York Fed, launched his own program on culture and conduct reform in banking. In 2016, I sat in on one of those conferences, got talking with someone from the Banking Standards Board. I said, boy, these regulators around the world are all talking about culture as a thing. I wish there were some resource that we could look to where we could see who is saying what in every jurisdiction. That reference didn't exist. We drew the short straw. And in 2017, we decided to start compiling some desk manual that would capture this information. We called it the Starling Compendium. We invited regulators and supervisors to contribute views. We were told in year one, no way, never. Year two, a couple of people said, that was pretty useful, we'll contribute. We just did our 8th version in June of this year. We have now had over 200 of the senior-most figures in the supervisory and regulatory community worldwide contribute to it. Culture is very much a thing. In our 2024 report, as we were putting it together, we detected a shift in the wind. The banking sector turmoil, as it has been called, of 2023, the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, the near failure of Credit Suisse, turned this from an issue that supervisors cared about to a matter of some supervisory priority. Regulators and supervisors had tended to talk about culture as something problematic. The thing about something being problematic is you learn to live with it. My lower back is problematic. It's not going away anytime soon. But when we call something a problem, we treat it differently. We insist that we dive into it, tear it apart, figure out what's behind it, and solve it. And what seemed to me to be the case was that supervisors were talking about culture as something for them that was problematic, but that for the industry was a problem. And we would hold you personally accountable if you failed to solve the problem. We would hit you with sanctions if you failed to solve the problem. And we expect the industry to figure out how to solve the problem. After the crisis of 2023, supervisors felt a little bit of pressure to start solving that problem themselves. Or at least that's what seemed to us in the compilation of our report. Randy Quarles is with us tonight, the former chair of the Financial Stability Board, the former vice chair of Supervision for the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. In our 2023 report, Randy sounded a call to action. He said, we really need to get the international standard setting community to have a look at this culture thing and figure it out. So with Randy's urging, with the urging of a few others around the world, we sort of decided to answer that call. Tiff Macklem, the governor of the Bank of Canada and the chair of what's known as the Governors and Heads of Supervision, the GHOS, wrote some closing comments to our compendium this year, and I'll just read a few lines. He said, resilience of firms as well as supervisory bodies depends on decision-making, and decision-making is shaped by the norms, incentives, and behaviors that define how institutions operate. It is shaped by culture. And we mustn't forget, he added, that regulators and supervisors also operate within the context of their own internal cultures. And so this culture topic is something that is very much so here, very much so present. So with the urgings of Randy and others, we decided that we would conduct a stock take. We would canvass the global supervisory community, and we would ask people, what do you think about this? Is this really something for supervisors? And if so, why? We've been working on this for a while. What have we learned in that time? We haven't cracked the nut on the issue, but what has it taught us? What has it instructed us about what we need to do going forward? And so we assembled a team of former regulators, former supervisors. We spoke with dozens of people in officialdom across the globe to try to distill some sense of the community's wisdom about this topic. And that report was produced in summary form today. It's about 30 pages. The full report will be released next month as a public exposure draft. That's about 300 pages of accumulated thoughts from the supervisory community. That public exposure draft is meant to open a public comment period. We invite stakeholders who have any views on the topic to offer those views. I expect them to range from this is complete gibberish to this is terribly important and everything in between. But let's have that dialogue. Let's capture all that information. And then that will inform the production of a final report that we will issue in the spring of next year. I won't say very much about the report's contents. Again, it was produced at 5 p.m. UK time, noon today. It's available on our website, and I encourage you all to have a look at it. But I will say that recent politics have made this topic fairly urgent. In this country, there is a tension between a secondary mandate of growth and competitiveness and a primary mandate of financial stability. How do we square that circle? Should there be a tension there? Is that tension itself false? The Chancellor of the Exchequer has made comments about boots on necks, which I know has gone down terribly well with the Governor of the Bank of England, who has just joined us. In the opposition, Nigel Farage has made comments of late that perhaps the Financial Conduct Authority shouldn't be in the business of supervision. Same sorts of sounds are being heard across the pond in my home country. Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent recently wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal where he complained of a, quote, broken supervisory culture. He accused the Fed of mission creep, a gain of function that needs to be re-examined, and has called for a review of the institution in its entirety. In the EU, the watchword is simplification. The ECB's governing council has convened a high-level task force to ask, can we streamline supervision? So with that, I'll stop and simply say that the function of supervision, in my estimation, is terribly important. The exercise of supervisory judgment is absolutely critical, but that judgment needs to be exercised within some defensible parameters, and how we achieve those is up for question, and we have a panel to hear from on that topic.
Thanks, Stephen. That was brilliantly entertaining. Loved it. Now we move to the next stage, the panel discussion of the evening. Would the panelists please come up? Brilliant. Let me introduce them in no particular order, other than I will start with the moderator on the very left, Clay Lowery, Executive Vice President of IIF, the Institute of International Finance. Clay oversees the departments responsible for macroeconomic analysis, international financial regulation, financial technology, and other policy areas. He has served in the US government for 15 years prior to that. And we have Jon Danielsson, hand up. Jon Danielsson at the very end, my colleague at LSE, is the co-director of the Systemic Risk Center at the LSE. He's a leading expert and author on risk and limitations and promises of regulation and economic policy. Then next, I have Steven Maijoor, hands up, excellent, who joined the executive board of the Nederlandsche Bank, DNB, in 2021, and before that he was also chair of supervision. Before that he was chair of ESMA from 2011 to 21. That was during MiFID II, was it not?
MiFID II, yes. And there's no MiFID III yet.
Next, we have Elizabeth McCaul, hand up. She served as a member of the Supervisory Board of the European Central Bank until last year. She focused on prudential implications to financial stability, including private credit markets, capital markets, and geopolitical risk. Last but not least, we have Carolyn Rogers. She's Senior Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada. Previously, she was Secretary General of the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. So we have that brilliant panel for 40 minutes, and then we have 10 minutes Q&A after that. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, JB. I also am a graduate from the London School of Economics, and I have not been here in 30-something years, and I had no idea this building even existed until right now. And anyway, but I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. I think Stephen laid out kind of obviously why we're here and what's the discussion a little bit. I just want to kind of highlight a little bit of why now. So we at the Institute of International Finance, for those of you who don't know what we do, we represent global financial institutions all over the world, banks, insurance companies, asset managers. Our bank members said they wanted to look at and think about much more effective supervision. And so we've just put out a report ourselves just a couple of weeks ago, which was a broader look. So this is obviously tonight is much more about the culture issues, but we try to take a broader look. And the reason why we did this is, and we've seen the official sector, not just the private sector, talk about this. And Stephen kind of referred to this, but let me just kind of point out a couple of things. The current vice chair for supervision of the Federal Reserve, so the position that Randy Quarles once held, Mickey Bowman, it's Michelle Bowman, but she goes by Mickey. She wrote, supervision it's a troubling trend of inaction and opacity. All right, that's the supervisor that was saying that. That wasn't, Clay Lowery representing a bunch of banks. That was the supervisor who said that. Sharon Donnery, who is at the European Central Bank supervisor, she basically just put out a speech and a report on trying to keep it simple in supervision, just not simpler. Just at the end of last week, Fernando Rostoy, he works for the Financial Stability Institute in Basel, so that he's the head of it. He basically actually referred to the report that I was talking about, the one we did, and talked about the importance for supervisors to get more predictable, to be more transparent, and to be careful about being overly prescriptive on its guidance. So all of these issues are coming up, and it suggests there is a sense we have got to reform our system. And so a part of that system is, how do we look at culture? And so I think that is what we're going to get into. And the person I want to turn to is you, Carolyn, from the Bank of Canada. Why should we even care? We have all these issues. I just talked about all these people want to reform supervision. You're a supervisor. Why should we care about culture as an aspect and how to think about it?
Okay, well, that's actually the question we started this project with. We invited all the sort of supervisors that we could think of and asked them if they wanted to help us pull apart this problem. And we started with the question of, should we care? Is culture something for supervisors to think about or do something about? And I don't know about you, Stephen, but I certainly thought that would take up a good part of the debate. I thought we would have to have this discussion and potentially get some kind of a consensus. And I sat in on a lot of the interviews, not all of them, but one that I sat in on, the answer was yes, and let me tell you why it's difficult. So we didn't even have a discussion about, is this the domain of supervision? There's a ton of experienced supervisors just even in this room tonight. Every single one of them can tell you a story about an institution that they were dealing with, that they were trying to get to change. And your toolkit is capital and liquidity and risk management and all that. And you might even have got that all in place, and you still lie awake at night and go, this is going to go badly. This is going to end badly. And you just know it. And it's something that you can't put your finger on. You don't have anything in your toolkit to fix it. So I think over the last few years, we've gone at this with all kinds of things, governance standards, fit and proper, senior management regimes, a variety of tools like that. My favorite one is non-financial risk. I don't know why we use that term. It drives me crazy. If you're a Prudential supervisor, it ought to be financial, or you shouldn't really be spending time on it. And I think we're frustrated. You guys are frustrated. I read your report. And so we're all ready to try and do something different.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. So talking about difference, maybe Stephen, at the Netherlands Central Bank, you all actually were talking earlier about 10-year anniversary of the reports here in England, but you also had an anniversary of a report labeled Supervision of Behavior and Culture. I guess foundations, practice, and future developments, make sure I get it all right. But then basically, what were some of the conclusions that you all reached and have you been able to implement any of this? And here we are 10 years later, what have we not been able to do, or what are we doing to actually try to address this?
Thank you very much, Clay, for that question. And I think I'm the third person to say that he studied for some time at the LSE. I'm probably the oldest one, and so the longest going back. And actually it was My PhD was on the costs and benefits of regulation, and I think that is still the topic here of today. So the book that we made at that time was a response to the financial crisis in the Netherlands. As you know, we had our share of problems as a result of the financial crisis. And particularly there was one bank where there was a very dominant CEO, very dominant shareholder. And as a result of that, there were problems around governance. And for example, no serious follow-up of reports on conduct issue with selling certain products. And ultimately, that resulted in a bank run. One of the clients, a vocal client of this bank, called upon for a bank run, and actually it started a bank run on this bank and ultimately led to the failure of the bank. So that really had an impact on DNB as an organization to think about these type of issues. So I think in our day-to-day supervision at this stage, behavior and using behavior and supervision is very important. I prefer to some extent the word behavior because culture makes it a little bit more, at least for a non-native speaker, a little bit more mystical. In reality, for me, is behavior. Culture is about specific behaviors in a specific country, in a specific family, in a specific corporation. But we look at behaviors, and behaviors directly influence prudential numbers and prudential risks. It relates to, for example, how effective is a board in terms of responding to changes in the risk environment, and how well does it, try to address those risks. What is anyhow the risk appetite of a board, of a CEO? So that is very important in terms of driving our prudential objectives. The instruments that we use were the ones that you were just mentioning, things like the fit and proper regime, looking at governance, what are the precise arrangements around governance, what are the rights of different persons in a board, also what are the possibilities for people and individuals to speak up in the organization. And so, yes, this directly ties to prudential objectives and also to prudential instruments we have. And I think some of them are very explicit, governance, fit and proper, but it also comes back in the supervisory dialogue that we regularly have with the financial institutions. Maybe 2 or 3 more quick remarks. First, I've been surprised how much impactful personalities can be on financial institutions and therefore on our prudential objectives. We have seen really very quick changes in both directions because of changes in the composition of the board, the way they cooperate, the dynamics in the board. And I think it's also very important, and I think that is one of the reasons there's some criticism around this area, like how does this fit in the current debate on regulation and supervision being sufficiently targeted, etc. I think it's really part of a risk-based approach where you focus really on the risk that may ultimately harm the prudential objectives of the bank. Finally, and I think it was already mentioned, we see it in the recent Basel Committee report on the market turmoil of 2023, is that behavioral issues played an important role as, short-term focus, excessive growth, no follow-up of supervisory instructions or advice. So I think it's important that we continue to look into this area.
Okay, thank you very much. So Elizabeth, all right, so when you were at the ECB, you helped lead some of the efforts on trying to figure out a data-driven approach, a better data, and in fact, this gets into what people refer to as SupTech or SupTech. SupTech, sorry, thank you, which is supervisory technology, I guess. And so how is that actually working? And is that an important aspect? How do you try to figure out, can you work with the private sector through some of these things? You're obviously supervising the private sector, but sometimes the private sector has better data, frankly, than the official sector. So how do you think about those type of issues?
Thank you. Yes, part of the mandate that I had as a board member at the ECB was the digital agenda, and a component of that, thank you, Andrea and Enria, for leading that, was on the SupTech agenda and how we equip supervisors in this incredible moment that we're living in with a technological renaissance, and how do we make our way through what can sometimes be inertia with respect to taking some risk and investing in technology in order to harness it. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that we're living in a moment where the possibility of agentic AI, of generative AI, is something that we have to engage with and harness. And we delivered 14 tools at the ECB into the hands of supervisors using machine learning, using generative AI. And these were not enormous systems that we delivered. They were really focused on particular tasks. And the tasks that we identified were ones that would benefit from simplification, meaning obtaining efficiencies in the process so that the human brains could be engaged in the much bigger issues that are out there. It's the case that we're not only living in a moment of technological renaissance, data is exploding, and the capability of any person to assess the amount of data that's coming across their desks, and I'd argue that officialdom has a tremendous amount of data, certainly coupled with what the private sector has, the possibilities are endless with how that can be exploited. We have to harness technology in order to be able to do that. Some of the, hurdles that we had to overcome were, I'll use the word, cultural ones. How do we trust a machine to give us information about things that previously we would have said would be judgment-based? And so, of course, what we've done is really run laboratory, where we're looking at the possibility of getting accurate information, even predictive information, out of the technology that we deliver into the hands of the supervisor against what the old-fashioned way tells us. So are the answers accurate? We know as supervisors we're famous for asking questions and for being risk averse. We know we have to challenge what's in front of us and to make sure that it's something that is completely accurate. I'd like to come back maybe to Stephen's comment a few moments ago, and also yours, Clay, about, and link it to this technology discussion. The why now about supervisors addressing, Carolyn, non-financial risk. Yes, let's change that. But because it is real risk, as Stephen has just said very clearly, where behaviors lead to institutional failures and lead to systemic problems across the system. And Stephen, you surprised me when you said that the most important driver of human behavior is a sense of belonging. I didn't know that. I thought it would have been survival, but maybe they are the same thing when you are operating in an environment where there is a tremendous pressure on a business model in a bank. And so, where we need to go with this technology is how can we access data of the public and the private sector to really look carefully in a predictive way about how we prevent institutional failures or how we can prevent systemic risk from occurring. I have to believe that it's in the realm of the possible, that there's more that the phrase, if you can measure it, you can manage it. It must be the case that we can come up with ways using the tools that are now in front of us in order to do that. And I just close with, I don't think we're here at a moment where we need a reform of the supervisory systems. I feel the need to make at least a sentence of defense. We're here when the banks are incredibly resilient at a moment when geopolitical risk is at heights we've never seen, when the complexity of the marketplace has grown exponentially with new entrants, fintech, technology, new providers of credit. We need to be able to assess a broader thing, but please rest assured that we're sitting here where banks have tremendous resiliency and they've demonstrated that. So it's a good moment to, I'll pick up on your comment of Mickey Bowman's correct comment about opacity. Supervisors have to have credibility, and if they are opaque about the way they do things, then we won't have that credibility. So this effort to explain culture and do it better, it's a tremendous moment for that.
That's a great point, and obviously it's good to defend as well. So, Jan, let me turn to you. You've actually written on some of these areas, and you actually argue that regulation sometimes displaces rather than reduces risk, which is an interesting point. And the judgment aspect that Elizabeth was just talking about, I would think becomes especially acute when you were thinking about behavior? And do we fall into a trap of basically coming up with qualitative aspects that becomes a ticking the box type of exercise, as opposed to kind of going towards what I think Elizabeth was leaning towards, which is how do we use technology and data to think about these things? So I know you've written on some of these areas. Maybe you can expound a little bit.
Your question is interesting, since the last time I was on a panel with an IIF chairperson, the discussion was quite similar, and that was 20 years ago. So things, the more things
It was
changed,
not me.
it was not you, but the more things changed, the more they remained the same. Now, I come to this as an academic, and I look at supervision from the outside. And of course, in that we are very fortunate. Andrea has part-time joined us in LSE and helps us to expand our understanding. But I look at it from the outside, and when I read what the supervisors write and listen to the words, I sometimes see the prevailing culture as they see undesirable outcomes as happening because the supervisors don't have enough resources, they don't have enough information, they don't have enough power. If only they knew the positions and if they knew the risk, and if they could force the private sector to bend to the will, all would be good. Now, I call this perfect supervision, and I think there's a paradox in that. The opposite is more likely to be true. The more supervision focuses on measuring and controlling risk, which has been the prevailing culture of the past 15 years, the more likely we are to end up in a place we don't want to end up in. And there are three reasons for this. The first is basic incentives. The more responsibility we give to the supervisors, the more we end up outsourcing risk management and hence responsibility to them. When things go wrong, is it the fault of the bank? Is it the fault of the supervisor? Well, the private sector knows this really well, and they're really good at exploiting this for their own private benefit. Now, the second problem relates to the fact that the only risk we can really measure with any degree of accuracy is day-to-day risk, value at risk and the like. These have no importance to almost anything. They don't matter for anything whatsoever in our lives. We cannot measure the risk of catastrophic events, like the likelihood of banks failing or the likelihood of financial crisis. But when we pretend we can, and we often pretend we can, we create a culture of complacency by focusing the attention on the least important eventualities because we got everything under control. And that gives plenty of space for the forces of instability to emerge elsewhere. And finally, when the inevitable shock happens, perhaps a war or a virus, our prudent financial institutions have no choice but to get rid of risky assets because that's what the regulations tell them to do. In practice, it means they have to sell into a falling market, and that makes financial institutions act as crisis amplifiers. This is, I don't think, is the intention. Now, at the root of this is a culture of risk management and control that I don't think is really up to the task at hand. A better way forward would be to borrow a basic principle of finance. Now, this event is hosted by the SRC and the FMG. Our host department is the Department of Finance, and our building is called the Marshall Building, named after one of the most successful hedge fund managers in the United Kingdom. Now, he knows, and successful investors know, that you diversify your portfolios. That is finance 101. Now, successful supervision would mean you diversify the system you supervise. The more diversified the system is, the more resilient it becomes, and the better performing it becomes, just like our portfolios. And to conclude, I do find it ironic that we don't apply the most successful principle of finance, diversification, to the supervision of finance.
Okay. All right, Stephen, I'm going to put you on the hook then. All right, so, all right. Stephen quoted Tiff Macklem, basically saying something. I'm not saying it was exactly what Jan was just saying, but he was saying we as supervisors also need to think about ourselves, right? What is our behavior? How should we do things? And so, and now we're have to figure out how to diversify supervision, which is an interesting point. How do you think about that? You're a supervisor, but you're also a manager. You manage an institution. You have to try to figure out what's happening at that institution. What's the behavior, to use your words, maybe culture, to use Stephen's words. How do you think about those issues right now?
So John said a lot, let me focus on one element. I don't think that the solution for supervisors is to get more and more data, more insight, etc. Of course, that is important, but I think a very important element in proper supervision, and it's coming back from the postmortems of the various field cases, is inertia. Is basically supervisors don't dare to act upon a certain piece of information because supervision means resistance. If you start acting upon it and say, this is a problem, this may really have a prudential impact, there will be pushback. There may be pushback within their own supervisory organization. There will be probably pushback from the supervised entity. And so one term that we have also used internally is we need to go from a culture of findings to a culture of remediation. Supervisors are very good in pointing out to the problems. Where are the failures of, or I shouldn't say failures, the shortcomings of financial institutions vis-a-vis the regulated requirements. But then focusing on which ones are really important, because with the whole raft of regulations, you will always find shortcomings by financial institutions. The real issue is following up on that and selecting where are the issues, where do I have the regulation, where there's a deviation that will really become problematic, and act upon it. And I think that is one of the difficult issues to manage as a manager in a supervisory organization, to find out where to focus on and where to go through and really think this is an issue and we need to push for change at the supervised institution. The problem there is that a generic message to staff in terms of be more bold or be stronger against your financial institution will not be the successful strategy, because sometimes they go for it and are bold, but on the wrong things, and they use a lot of legal stuff, process matters, without really having the focus on the substantive issue that is really important for the prudential objectives. So I think that is one core issue that at least is important for me in my organization. And the other element related to this, supervision is risk-based, should be risk-based. There will be inevitably some failures. Of course, the intention is to keep that to smaller ones and try to limit the failures as much as possible. But when you prioritize, there's always the risk that it still goes wrong later on. And I think you need to empower staff to say, and supervisors, I'm going to prioritize, and then after, sometimes if it appears that the prioritization didn't focus on a small risk that later on develops and gets bigger, you shouldn't hold that person accountable and say, we've done the prioritization, we support you, and even then later on it may become a bigger risk that you didn't act upon rightly and on time.
Okay, that's a great answer. And so, Elizabeth, I mentioned something earlier, which was that supervisory board member Sharon Donnery just put out this, really a paper speech on, and I'm going to quote, as I paraphrased it earlier, which is as simple as possible, but not simpler. I don't completely know what that means, but it's an interesting point. She's trying to say, look, we are trying to do some reforms here. But let's now take it what Stephen was just talking about, which is, all right, I have this institution and I have to reform it. I have to figure out, how do I prioritize? How does my staff prioritize? How do we not just focus on every single issue because a financial institution can't react to every single issue? So I guess, I know you've chaired one of the chapters on supervisors on supervision. how do you think about those type of issues given this context, I guess?
Thank you. So I wondered what Sharon meant also about as simple as possible, but not simpler, so I looked it up. It's a quote by Einstein, and don't laugh, but actually what Einstein said was, the supreme goal of all theory is to make the irreducible elements as simple and as few as possible without having to surrender the adequate representation of a single datum of experience. That's actually what he said. And I think that explains it a little bit better in terms of, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, to quote Sam Woods. And, there's at the moment that we're in, where the discussion is about the need for simplification, and there's no doubt that there is a need for simplification. The rules have become complicated. Sometimes they lead to cultural norms inside supervisory authorities that drive tick box, because if I have all of these rules, then I've got to go through all these things. And if I did them all, no one can blame me. So we have to really think about moving to simplification, but in a way that doesn't lower the bar on the regulatory standards, but makes it easier for the banks to comply and makes it easier for the supervisors to do the job, and to focus, both supervisor and supervised entities, to focus on the really important things. Where do we have to mitigate risk? How do we remediate so that we have a stronger institution capable of driving a better business model and more profitability down the road? This is an objective that has to be in place. So I see the work that we're doing here, and I love what Carolyn said, that we thought there might be a debate about whether culture was something important to measure, because there's been so much in recent months said about that on the negative side. But what we found is that there's a real consensus around the need to do this in a less opaque way, to do it in a more data-driven way, and to deliver on some of the metrics and explanations so that it can be done properly, and not drive a tick box culture or activity in the banks or in the supervisors themselves. I would just close with, I'm so impressed with this work that everyone has done. I think it was something very brave to take it on, and I'm very glad to be here.
Can I follow up on one point on that, which is, why is it brave?
Because it's naming something that is being roundly criticized at the moment. And the supervisors are under incredible fire. I would say they need support because they're there. They're not doctors. They're not saving people's lives. What are they doing? They're saving people's life savings. That's rather important. And what that does is lead to a strong economy and good life for citizens, good societies. So they're being attacked because it hasn't been explained so well. But the root cause of the great financial crisis was found around the globe to be a culture that drove behavior, that drove outsized risk-taking, that then brought countries to their knees. So since it hasn't been so well explained and it's being so criticized, the culture word has become a dirty word. So why even take it on? Why not just fold the tent and say, yeah, you're right, we should just focus only on financial risk? I think it's brave to say, as is correct, this is something that truly matters, and we have to figure out how to explain how we do it. We need to do it better using technology, and we need to be very transparent about how that works.
I was going to go to you, but you look like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I want to pick up on a couple of the points, starting with John's about the need to diversify supervision. And I guess maybe this is a bit of what Elizabeth is doing, is sort of in defense of supervisors around the world. I mean, first of all, to set up the culture issue, right? Supervisors are trained to prevent bad things from happening. And banks and financial institutions are, they live to make good things happen. So right there, you have a culture that's going to be difficult to reconcile. So, and supervisors do a job that's largely invisible. there is nobody that sort of adds up the public good of a sound financial system at the end of the year and rewards supervisors for actually preserving it. So it's a pretty thankless job. It's a job where you get blamed if it goes wrong, but you don't get any credit if it goes well. So right there you have a culture that doesn't promote sticking your neck out and taking a chance and digging in or pushing something or being brave, quite honestly. So I think that needs to be said. Do we create risk by not allowing for enough diversification? I mean, the thing that I was told over and over again when I started my career is consistency. You have to be consistent. You have to, same risk, same regulation. You have to always treat everybody the same, equal. So, I mean, that's why you have that problem. And I think the why now is because I think, you know, we're in that cycle. Every sort of experienced supervisor knows the cycle. You have a regulate cycle, and then you have no, regulation's killing growth, and now we're in we need more growth and less regulation cycle, and that's good. And there is, I think, as Elizabeth said, there is room to streamline all of the regulation that we've put in place over the last 10 years to revisit some of it. But words like simplify and that are often code for deregulate. And I think the scariest thing about this cycle to me is not the simplification and not even, is there room? Are we over resilient? Is there room to let up a bit? That doesn't worry me. What worries me is this call to get rid of judgment. Mm-hmm. I think that would be a disaster. I think it would contribute to more of the risk that John talks about. I can tell you why the Basel Compendium of Rules is something like 700 pages instead of 200 when we started. It's because every single bank comes along and says, I don't mind the rule, but can you just put in these 3 points to make sure that my bank is recognized, the unique thing about my bank. And so we end up with this complex set of rules that are difficult to supervise and costly to administer if you're a bank. So did they get complex because of supervisors, or did they get complex because of banks? Maybe you strip it all back and you give more judgment to the supervisor.
All right, so let me push you a little bit on that. So how can supervisors preserve judgment to fulfill their mandate, but address these broader concerns about transparency and predictability that are not being said necessarily just by banks or private sector, but are being said by Mickey Bowman, Fernando Ristoy, and Sharon Donnery.
Yeah.
So people that are
and I would agree with those people.
Okay.
I think we need to be more transparent. I think we actually do need to be more predictable. I spent most of my career in supervision. I've been in central banking the last few years. And we use a term in central banking. We have these code terms for everything, but we call it the reaction function, which is this sort of set of things that we react to that makes us predictable to markets. And we talk about it all the time. We have a framework, we lay them out. We go to great pains at every press conference to say them over and over and lay them out and be clear and describe them and make sure they're measurable and point to them. And when we change, we make sure we tell everybody we've changed. We're looking at that, not that now. That's a discipline, I think, in central banking that we could borrow a bit more in supervision, is being clear, what do we react to? What are the things we watch? How do we measure them? How do we acknowledge them? Being very transparent when they change. We tell people, just becoming more transparent and more predictable.
Okay. All right, John, let me come back to you. So you've heard a little bit of pushback on some of your thoughts. So I want you to be able to address that. But then secondly, let me throw another complication in there, which is something I know you've also written on, which is artificial intelligence and how to think about what does that do to this kind of stew and to make it either more complicated or maybe makes it easier and simpler. So,
well, it will do both, but but let's contrast the issues. The private sector is spending multiple tens of billions of dollars on AI every year, and the private sector is spending more every year. The public sector is spending a tiny fraction of that. So the arms race between the public sector and the private sector has been won by the private sector in this. And therefore, we should ask ourselves, how does that change in dynamics change the systems? I don't think we've ever seen such asymmetry ever in between the public and the private sector as with AI. And let me just quote one statistics. Bloomberg reported recently that the median salary of a European banking AI expert is $750,000, the median. Now, that is not something we're going to see even by governors of central banks today. And that tells us where the asymmetry lies. Now, the problem with the asymmetry is it creates the risk of very serious undesirable events. To begin with, the private sector finds it increasingly easy to manipulate and outwit the supervisors. The private sector now uses AI to produce the database dumps and PDF reports the supervisors still prefer. And it's very easy to optimize against an increasingly archaic supervisory process that depends on practices that are no longer reflected by how the private sector operates. So that asymmetry alone to me, is a fairly big concern. And secondly, with AI, the risk of financial crisis significantly increases. Now, we have known since the beginning of banking that the optimal behavior for every bank in times of extreme stress is to withdraw liquidity from the system. Historically, they bought gold. Now they park it at the reserve account at the Bank of England. Now we have a world where commercial banks spend a significant amount of their AI budget on the treasury function, the management of liquidity. And let's put that into context of what might happen in a crisis. Well, what happens is when those private sector AI that are managing commercial banks' liquidity spot a crisis or uncertainty underway. Well, optimally, they want to be the first to withdraw. They want to be the first to park the money at the reserve account at the Bank of England. Banks have always done so. We also know that you want to be the first, not the last. Now, because AI is so good at analyzing the world, it is so good at reacting to the world, so good at reacting quickly, it compresses the reaction time in crisis from what might be days or weeks into minutes or hours. So if you want to, just sort of as an anecdote, in a crisis, you might have a phone call between Andrew and the CEO of HSBC as to how UK PLC will react to the crisis. Well, now you might be in a world where the HSBC AI has reacted before we have a time for the human-based intervention to take place. And if the authorities are not able to match the speed, and so far they've not been able to, that endogenously makes crisis more likely. So the consequence of the very significant private sector investment in AI not being met by the public sector is an increased risk of undesirable events, abuse, manipulation, failure, crime, and crisis. Now, of course, there are concrete things the authorities can do to deal with this. They can build up their own AI expertise, and I suspect most are now trying to do that. When AI gives opportunities, we can benchmark regulations with AI to AI interfaces. This actually might allow for more effective regulations with less data sharing, so we can actually we can make the whole process cheaper and more effective for everybody. We can do system-wide learning using a technique called federated learning. So the supervisors could have a global view of the system without data sharing, which is always the problem when it comes to creating a joint view. And of course, knowing AI, there are particular ways we can monitor it. So AI creates risks. It also creates opportunities. All depends on, but ultimately, the likelihood of an undesirable outcome is directly proportional to the degree of which the authorities are prepared and how the private sector AI perceive the public sector AI when they make decisions.
Okay. I'm hesitating only, I'm cognizant I'm supposed to ask for Q&A from the audience, I believe, at this point in time. You just put out a lot of stuff right there. I felt like I was going back to the early 80s movie, the movie War Games, where everything's automatic. I'm not Matthew Broderick. So let me see if there's some questions in the audience. And if gentleman in the back ready to start us.
Can I just add to wait for the microphone?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Wait for the microphone. No, you can do that. But wait for the microphone. Tell us your name and your affiliation, please, and then you can ask a question.
Sorry about that.
Hi, I'm Orestes Niku, Deutsche Bank. So, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Better? Okay. Name is Orestes Niku, Deutsche Bank. Thank you very much. Question on non-banks. So, as supervisors, obviously focus on culture, among other things, with banks. That probably, creates an incentive for people who, don't have the right culture to move to non-banks. What do you do about that? What does it mean for risk sort of happening in the shadow sector? Thank you.
Is that question aimed at any specific person?
No, open question.
Steve, thank you for being
As you
brave.
mentioned, I was 10 years responsible for non-banks, and some would call it the shadow banking sector. I think there is, as a result of the financial crisis, there's been a quite intense regulation and supervisory wave for the non-banking sector, and so I think the big parts of the financial sector, non-bank sector, are supervised and regulated. The point around, is there kind of, is it becoming too attractive to be a non-bank? As you know, in Europe, I think at least the European Union, I think the UK is better, but let's say talk about the European Union, we could benefit from some better balance between, let's say, the non-banking sector. One of the weaknesses of the European Union has been a very large banking sector, and we would very much support, and DNB very much support a stronger non-banking sector. Obviously, the type of risks are different, the type of supervision is different, but I think it will be difficult to say that it's less regulated. And I think there are some arguments in most of the cases. There are some imbalances in both sectors, I would say, but by and large, I think you can explain them.
Right there.
Oh, yeah. David Gross, long-term banker, now behavioural risk consultant, so I sort of straddle both worlds.
Can you speak up a little?
Sure. The question I'm going to ask is, if we try and over-regulate the world of culture and behaviour, obviously it'll have the law of unintended consequences, as we well know. Isn't the key thing we need to do to actually ensure that both for the banks themselves and for the regulators, that they actually have the understanding, the skill set, the capability to understand human behaviour in a bit more detail? So behavioural science, organisational psychology, whatever it may be. I speak to a lot of banks, I speak to a lot of regulators, and I'll be blunt, the level of understanding is nowhere near where it needs to be. And if you compare that to something like crypto or AI or any of those areas where everybody recognises the banks and regulators need those skills, but for some reason the behavioural side is left to one side, and it's a yawning gap. There's a question to everybody, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think you'll hear that in the report. I think supervisors are perfectly willing to admit that we need to round out our skills and toolkit. The other thing I would say is what you won't read in the report, and what I don't think you heard tonight, is that the goal of all this is to regulate culture. I don't think that we think that that's the answer. I mean, the way I define regulation is a bunch of rules. Supervision is sort of the enforcement of those rules. Nobody's diagnosed this to the point that we're prescribing a big rule book for this. I don't think that's where we're at. So.
Jan and Elizabeth.
I just want to echo the point in the question, and work we've done here at LSE supports this. I think one should always remember that decisions in the financial system are made by human beings, not by automatic rules. And in times of extreme stress, especially, those decisions are made by human beings under future constraints, in a future situation. We have no idea how they will behave. So the reason why we cannot model or understand risk of extreme outcomes is exactly because of the human element and because we don't know how future decision makers will make decisions. And that is fundamentally the reason why risk is not measurable for anything that is serious.
And I would just quickly add that Carolyn is right, that the objective isn't to regulate culture. The objective is actually to measure it in a far more predictable way and to make that very clear, especially given that we have the capability of using tools that have not been available heretofore. The default has been, not incorrectly, to look at the structures inside institutions and to ensure that the right board structures are in place, the right risk committees are in place, the right checks and balances are in place, and to try to discern where there are weaknesses there and then to put remediation programs in place. I think where we need to go in some way is to measure culture and measure behaviors in a way that becomes predictive and outcome-based. And one thought that I have had is we're really good at analyzing the failures where there's been a spectacular blow up in an institution, and we analyze what contributed to that, and we put in place structures so that we responses and reactions so that we do a better job of that, like remediation more quickly, for example. But I think we might, Carolyn, picking up on something you said before, we might be well served to look at some of the successes or where institutions are driving appropriate cultures and how they're measuring that, not just the failure side of it.
I think that's a great point.
Because there's more of those, actually.
Yeah.
There's way
No, no,
more
More
of
of those
those.
than failures, so.
Absolutely. Let me, the lady right there in the middle, but hold, let me just check on our time here. No, I didn't know whether to pick up a couple of questions or not, because, all right,
Thank you. Can I?
go ahead. We'll do this one, and then we'll do one more, and then I think we're out of time.
Thank you. Be very quick. Thank you so much. My name is Sylvia Pavoni. I'm a journalist with a publication called The Banker. I wonder, you've talked about AI as a way of helping in anticipating behavior. Do you also have a view on potentially regulating AI and the issues with dealing with hallucinations and the other challenges that everyone using AI is facing? Thank you.
Okay, I think that's it's a good point. It's a follow-up a little bit to the points that John, you were making earlier, but who wants to try to take this one? It's, yeah.
Sorry, Emma, but the AI Act is underway in the European Union, and it's around regulation and supervision of issues around explainability, making sure that data are properly protected, is that there's no discrimination, etc. So that is regulated, but I'm not sure whether that is your question. As you asked, will it be regulated? Yes, it will be regulated. And currently, there's discussions in most of the European member states is who will be responsible, and will also the financial sector regulators be responsible for this horizontal piece of legislation.
Just a really quick point. There is a lot of wishful thinking when it comes to regulating AI. And something I've heard a lot of people say, well, we would never allow models that are not explainable. Now, I don't think models are explainable today, and AI models will not be explainable. So I think those who want to regulate AI, they might often want to become more realistic as to what the technology actually is.
Yeah, one other point on that, just to personally, is AI is a broad subject, and the financial sector is a much more narrow thing. And if so, how supervisors and regulators have to look at what's happening in the financial sector may be quite different than what's happening in the much broader thought pattern on what to do with AI. One last question.
Thank you very much. My name's Al Mehmet. I'm a former diplomat. May I ask Jon Danielsson, what exactly would diversified supervision look like? Can you give those of us who are sort of ignorant on the subject an idea? And secondly, would AI have perhaps helped avoid the Icelandic banking crash of 2008?
Now, let me do the last one first. By the way, some crises are profitable to countries. Iceland profited from its banking crisis. They borrowed enormous amounts of money from foreign banks. I'm really grateful for Citigroup and the Deutsche Landesbanken and the like. And then when Iceland defaulted, the profits and everything was left in Iceland and it was left to the taxpayers of those countries to pick it up. So it was a good crisis, not a bad crisis. Now, come to the first point. What I mean is that supervision now pushes towards homogeneity. It tries to make banks see the world increasingly in the same way and react to the world in the same way. And if you look at the discussion of shadow banking, it is trying to push shadow banks into the same mold. The more similar we make the institutions of the system both see the world and react to the world, the more pro-cyclical they become. They all chase the same bubbles, they all chase the same crisis. So therefore, paradoxically, by making institutions more homogeneous, exactly what the point that Carolyn mentioned earlier is so important here, we actually end up in the wrong place. We end up amplifying movements in the system, not dampening them out. So therefore, when I talk about diversification, what I mean is that if you take the United States, the total assets of the US banking system is 85% of GDP. This is astonishing. The total assets of the British banks or the German banks or the Chinese banks or the Japanese banks are 2 or 3 or 4 times GDP. Now, why is that? Now, I think this is one of the US's greatest strengths. It is the fact that financial intermediation mostly takes place outside of banks. What this meant that after the crisis in 2008, it made it much easier for the US authorities to force the US banks to increase capital, to increase liquidity, to get their act together. The Europeans couldn't afford to do so because it would damage the local economy. So the Europeans tried to do the same with the Capital Markets Union 15 years ago, which ran into a brick wall of lobbying. But that was a really good initiative. So the way you can use the diversification powers is if the supervising authority encourages new financial institutions to set up shop with different business models that are different from the established models, if you just the permission process can encourage diversification of the institutions of the system, this endogenously would diversify the system. That's really what I meant.
Okay. Thank you all very much.
Absolutely.
Thanks for the panel.
As we continue to explore these very important themes, we are shifting to a more intimate setting for an in-depth conversation, what we call the Fireside Chat. We are very honored to have Andrew Bailey, Governor of the Bank of England, and Randal Quarles, Chairman and founder of the Cynosure Group, with us tonight. We all know Andrew Bailey has been the Governor of the Bank of England since March 2020. He is now also the Chair of the Financial Stability Board. Previously, he served as CEO of the Financial Conduct Authority, also member of the Prudential Regulation Committee, the Financial Policy Committee, and the board of the FCA. Randal Quarles, before he founded the Cynosure Group, an alternative asset management and wealth advisory firm, he was Vice Chairman of the Federal Reserve System, serving as the system's first Vice Chairman for Supervision. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Bailey and Randal Quarles to the stage. The plan is to have them here for 35 minutes, and I think you agree to have 10 minutes Q&A at the end. You agree to have 10 minutes Q&A? Brilliant. So 35 minutes fireside chat, and then we open again to your Q&As.
Quite intimate.
Right.
Well, again, thank you, Governor Bailey. It's a great privilege to have you here. It's a great privilege to have the opportunity to talk through some of these issues with you, both in your
role as governor of the Bank of England over one of the principal financial centers of the world, and as chair of the Financial Stability Board, coordinating these issues globally. As the prior panel discussed, as Stephen Scott mentioned, the kind of genesis of this event is we're introducing the deeper dive report on supervision, particularly culture supervision, that Starling has put out with input from senior, current, and former regulators around the globe. Maybe at the risk of a very broad question, we could start with asking what your assessment is of the key issues facing supervisors right now. You don't have to answer all of that. That would sort of tee you up for a 45-minute keynote speech. But just at the top of your mind, what do you think are some of the key issues that supervisors need to address?
Well, thanks, Randy. I should say, because I'm chair of the FSB, I'm really talking to the esteemed former chair of the FSB. And this is only the second conversation we've had today, actually. I also say that I can't quite claim to have got a degree. I can't claim to have a degree from the LSE, but I have been married to the LSE for the last 36 years. And if I got that number wrong, I'm going to pay for this later. Right? I think it's very interesting. And I thought the previous panel was fascinating in terms of the range of issues. And I think one of the things that stands out for me is why supervision is such a difficult activity and so interesting is that you and I know, I mean, let's go back 2.5 years almost exactly to the events around Credit Suisse and Silicon Valley Bank, which happened successive weekends. And I can tell you that the aftermath of that, there was a lot of discussions about. There's always discussions about where were the supervisors, and then what we need is more supervision. And I sat through some discussions about we need to do it this way, we need to do it that way, and I find it interesting. Roll the clock forward to today, and we've already moved to we need to simplify things. Are the supervisors too intrusive? Are they getting in the way of competitiveness? Are they getting in the way of growth? And the conclusion I draw from that is that this is, I'm sad to say after so many years involved in it, it's still not a completely stable system, which is why the report is so important, by the way, which is why we keep having to come back to this issue, because that's one of the, the clear messages I take from this, that we haven't achieved stability, even though, as Elizabeth rightly said, actually, if you look at let's take the resilience of the banking system. The banking system in all countries pretty much has actually come, notwithstanding what I said about 2.5 years ago, actually has come through all the many shocks of the last sort of 5 years in a very good state, and that is because it is more resilient. A final point I'll make about this sort of paradox, I look at many banking systems today, actually including our own, and take the major UK banks as a group. For most of the time since the financial crisis, they were not earning the return that matched their cost of capital. We'd put the capital requirements up. It's a long haul back to where we are today, where they actually are. They are earning a return which equals slightly above their cost of capital. That's reflected in the price to book ratios in markets. And yet I am facing challenge from various parts of the sort of the field saying they're essentially it's a version of they're making off like bandits. And that again, I think you have to stop and pause and think that's one of the paradoxes and challenges that we face.
So yeah, you referenced the Silicon Valley Bank. I actually remember that very well because on the day it happened, we were having lunch here in London at the Guildhall, and neither of us knew it was happening for another hour. So the previous panel mentioned that really around the world right now, despite the points that you just made, legislatures, politicians, not just the banks, are questioning the reach and activity of supervision. Really less than regulation, I think, at the moment. It's really, the discussion is around supervision. Maybe it's just parochialism on my part, that I think people tend to think that's especially in the US, but it's really not only there. You know, in the UK, MPs are pushing for more predictable, less arbitrary supervisory outcomes. You've got, you know, recourse to ombudsman-like mechanisms, more ability to challenge supervisory judgments. In the EU, Elizabeth McCaul, you know, was referring to significant reforms to the SREP being more predictable, being streamlined, shorter, clearer supervisory decisions. In the US, the phrase we've tended to use around that is more due process around supervisory actions. And all of that is at least superficially and maybe fundamentally in tension with the tradition, which is perhaps especially in the UK, of supervision through the waggling of the governor's eyebrows. Or judgment. So what principles do you think should guide supervisors as they think about how to respond to this probably appropriate pressure or call for more predictability, more due process, while at the same time retaining a role for judgment?
Well, it's a great question. So, you know, I agree with the reports. I agree with you, Randy, that judgment is at the heart of it. Ultimately, as a supervisor, you have to make judgments. This is where supervision sort of, in a sense, sits on top of regulation. And you're right, you know, you can, I think, be accused quite easily, you know, almost on the same day, of both being at fault for using judgment and being at fault for not using judgment. And that is, in a way, a fact of life. So what do you do about that? And it has to be evidence-based, first of all. Now, sometimes the evidence is staring you in the face and sometimes it isn't. You know, I've had very good supervisors come in, you know, see me and say, you know, this just doesn't look right. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you can say, yeah, because I can see X, Y, and Z. If you put X, Y, and Z together, and sometimes they're just saying it really is a hunch because I think they're actually misleading us, or, you know, this just doesn't smell right. And then you have to sort of ask the question, well, how do we put the evidence, you know, what evidence base do we need and how much time have we got to do this? Jorn is right, by the way, that of course the challenge we live in this today's world is that time can actually, you know, compress greatly in the world that we find. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes. But I think at that point it's where, you know, you have to have, you know, people who have got very strong judgment, who've had experience and can say, look, this is what doesn't look right. The other thing I'd say about supervision, one of the great strengths of supervision, where we're at an advantage, I think, against the industry, is that we can see the peer group. And so we can, of course, always say, look, I can put them against the peers and say, why are they somehow standing out? Why are they somehow experiencing problems that others are not experiencing? What is it about that one that is different? Sometimes, of course, unfortunately, the whole peer group gets itself into trouble, but, you know, you can and must put the sort of the peer group comparison evidence to work.
So is there is it possible that you can square the circle, or, you know, move towards squaring the circle through the use of some of these new technologies as perhaps providing additional basis for judgment, as Elizabeth McCaul has talked about, as Stephen Scott has talked about. That is to say, you've got a call for, we need to have more transparency around how these judgments are reached. At the same time, there's, I think, if not a universal, a very widespread view that supervisory judgment is sort of not only inherent in the supervisory process, but very beneficial. Does, handling some of does using some of these new technologies with respect to easily aggregating and analyzing data help do both of those things?
Well, I've no doubt, and I think Elizabeth's right on this point, that we are all, and I think we've all got to invest heavily in data and data science and techniques, because supervisors and regulators are great sort of suckers up of data and evidence. We've all got vast amounts of it sitting in our systems, and none of us, I think, can put our hand on our heart and say that we're sort of optimally using it all. It would be pretty strange if, frankly, if anybody tells you that, I would just not believe them. And that's inefficient. I think one of the strongest points firms have on simplification is to rightly complain about the inefficiency of processes involving evidence and data. It also creates the danger for the authorities that you've got the evidence in the building and you haven't been able to, you haven't used it. Mm-hmm. That it subsequently comes out that actually somewhere in your systems was the smoking gun. And you haven't processed it, you'd missed it, you looked at it and not realized the significance of it. I mean, that's a recurring concern for all of us. So I think, Elizabeth's absolutely right that the more we can do to not only make the process more efficient, but actually better in that sense. But we can't, and I think this point came up in the panel, we can't and we shouldn't, of course, substitute ourselves for the risk management of the firms. So one of the, I'll be careful about the anecdotes we tell, because most of them are sort of either get me into prison or into court in some way or another. But one of the things that I've done occasionally in my past, when particularly when I was running Prudential Supervision, something blew up around the world. Actually, it's sort of quite interesting to ring up the CEOs of banks and say, so what's your exposure to this, and see if they know, or how quickly they know, or if they just tell you a number and you turn out to be completely wrong at the end of the day. There are a few tricks of the trade.
Shifting gears just a little bit, we've been talking about calls from politicians and others for more transparency, simplicity, predictability of supervision, but those are, I don't think those are necessarily inappropriate, and one can deal with those on an intellectual level. But there's on the question of political accountability and direction, do you think that there is a difference, since in most jurisdictions around the world now there is a direct connection between the central bank and bank supervision? Do you think there is a difference between the political direction that is appropriate for regulatory and supervisory matters versus monetary policy?
Well, I mean, the reality is it's different. So when people talk about independence in respect of monetary policy, and they talk about independence in respect of regulatory supervision, they are very different animals. Now, I think there are reasons for that. I think supervision and regulation gets you right into the heart of outcomes, not only for firms, but also for consumers. So it gets you into distributional questions very quickly. It gets you into questions that are much more sort of sharply focused in terms of interests. So I think monetary policy is easier in that sense to insulate from it. It doesn't always work, but it's easier, the vast majority of the time to create that sort of independence, preserve it, maintain it, and it works. It's just not, it's much more complicated in the world of regulation and supervision. So it's perfectly reasonable for, I think for governments to say to me, look, if you're dealing with a firm from this other country, if you're about to sort of do them over, or do something to them, obviously the government does have to maintain relations with the government of this other country. This doesn't happen very often, by the way, just to be clear. But, it's perfectly reasonable for a government to say, I think we do need to know, where this is all headed and, what's going to happen, because, there are wider repercussions. That's one example, but I could quote a number. I think, if I go back to my experience at the FCA, in conduct regulation, I think it's even harder because you're right in the sort of the interplay between interests of consumers and interests of firms, and they are very different. And I remember, I'll give you an example actually, not in the US. I remember when we were dealing with the payday lending industry here.
Mm-hmm.
So we had, when I went to the FCA, we did a mission statement actually very early on. And one of the things in our mission statement was, because the thing about the FCA is, you've got, in my day, you had over 50,000 firms. You cannot have line of sight in close order of 50,000 firms. The PRA is much smaller in terms of the stock of regulated banks and insurers. So you have to decide where are you going to put your troops on the battlefield, as it were. And one of the things we said was, look, where the firms are dealing with vulnerable consumers, we are going to be more on the field. So that's where you get payday lending. Now, I remember having a discussion with, I won't say which administration it was in, with, the then head of the consumer and the bureau,
Yes,
the one that doesn't
CFPB.
exist. The one that doesn't exist anymore.
It shouldn't exist.
I'm not going to go into that. And the person said, look, we think we're going to get a lot of criticism from Congress for being too activist in this field, and we wouldn't go anywhere near what you're doing. And it was quite interesting because it illustrated, there is a huge range of things you can do in those areas. So there is judgment, and it will be politically controversial.
So let's talk a little bit about whether there are concrete measures that supervisors could take to demonstrate accountability and restraint, again, while still maintaining their appropriate role, whether that's making supervisory methodologies public or putting time limits on remediation schedules. In the U.S., certainly, the remediation schedules in response to supervisory criticisms are open-ended and sometimes extend for many years, even a decade, or whether there should be increased specificity in remediation requirements, not just be better, but you must do X, Y, and Z by particular dates. Is there due process scaffolding, concrete things that could be put in place to reassure those who are questioning that supervisors are constrained by design while nonetheless active in their role?
Well, I think, of course, there's an important question about the governance of the supervision process itself. I better be careful because I've got several members of the Prudential Regulation Committee in the audience tonight. I can see them. When we set up the PRA, so this is 13 years ago, we did bring more governance into play. We did say we are going to have, for all the major firms, we are going to have an annual review of the firm, where it's sort of across the board annual review of the firm by the staff, and it will then come to the committee, and the committee will sign off on it. Because I felt that in the previous regime there just was not a line of sight. That is going to put some sort of system into the thing. Mm-hmm. But it's also, in a sense, it's there for the supervisors to be able to say to the firm, look, this is not just us, this has been through our governance. Mm-hmm. We've got a committee which is a mixture of executives and people appointed from outside with, with vast experience. It's more, I think, more systematic. It was interesting in the sort of the pre-crisis world where I think, that had slipped away. I remember, tell you some anecdotes about this actually when we set that system up, and some of the supervisors said to me, "What do you want to see?" And I said, "Well, look, call me old-fashioned, but I do like to see a balance sheet." And the funny story here is that this is when we started supervising insurers for the first time. I'd not supervised insurance before. And I said this to the insurance supervisor, and they said, "Which one?" At that point, no, if you know, insurance has several accounting standards, but it's a reasonable answer, but it sort of, coming from a banking background, said, "You what? You can't be serious." But we did that to sort of, in a sense, create rigor, but also robustness behind it. I think you have to be able to explain yourself to the firm. We go to boards and present these things to boards. They don't always like everything they hear, but I think and you have to accept the challenge back. I think, and when they come back and say, "Well, we don't agree with you on this," well, okay, we'll have that one out, as it were, and you can put your case. We've introduced obviously tools. I mean, stress testing is a tool that we've obviously introduced. There's no single killer tool, by the way, that does everything. That's a mistake. But we've introduced, I think, more rigorous tools in that sense. So again, you can show firms up. I think one of the virtues of stress testing is they can see the peer group. Mm-hmm. The firm that came in on the first stress test we did and had a higher capital ratio after the first pass of its stress test in stress than it did pre-stress. You think, I remember saying to you, they say, "What, you've shorted the whole world?" Really? But the point is, you've got to be able to say to them, "Sorry, look, honestly, you're out of line. You're out of line with your peers."
So, considering a little bit your global role as chair of the FSB, I thought one of the interesting aspects of the Starling report that's coming out today on supervision was that it showed a wide variation in legal and cultural traditions, in part because it's focused on supervision of culture. How much convergence on measures and transparency with respect to supervision and regulation is necessary to avoid regulatory arbitrage, and where do you have to allow national discretion to prevail?
That's a really good question. Well, it's a really good question.
Topical given our lunchtime conversation.
Well, first of all, of course, you're right that, of course, we are dealing with different legal systems. We have to recognise that. I mean, that's a fact of life. I remember people in the US saying to me after Silicon Valley that they said they really liked seeing some of the letters we write to firms, but you wouldn't be able to get away with that in the US because you'd be straight into court. So there are differences. And by the way, I'm sure there are things other places can do that we don't do. I think you have to have, where you're dealing with firms that are obviously international by nature, one of the things that we have actually been successful, particularly since the financial crisis, is the flow of cross-border information and the amount of time we spend talking to one another, and more particularly the openness of those conversations. I think that was a critical post-crisis thing.
During COVID, that was incredibly useful. Yeah.
And of course, by the way, I think this point was being made in the earlier panel. I think Carolyn was making the point. These are the things that don't get talked. It's like an iceberg. Most of the stuff doesn't get talked about. But I think the conversations today, the planning today. If you think about the resolution planning, this is probably one of the huge changes is resolution planning. How do we solve too big to fail with international banks? And to do that, you've got to be prepared to sort of be open book with other authorities in ways that I remember back in earlier times, people would have just been saying, telling them that, But that's the only way you can really, feel more confident that you can actually deal with these situations if they arise.
Let's consider the calls for transparency, which I think everyone's in favor of transparency until it's their underwear that's being exposed. So how transparent should supervisors be about their methods in order, again, to satisfy demands for accountability while still protecting institution-specific data?
Well, that's challenging. So I think you should be transparent about the methods. I think the problem is that supervision by its very nature is dealing with large amounts of very commercially confidential information. I mean, that's the nature of the thing. And if you cannot be confident that you can deal with that, and more particularly, you cannot convey that confidence to the firm, then you will suffer a breakdown of the relationship, and then the ability to supervise is severely impaired. Because I think one of the things that is a foundation of this is trust between the firm and the supervisor. The firm trusts what the supervisor is doing, that the information is not going to get out, and the supervisor can therefore trust the firm to not to sort of under-provide the information, as it were, to suit their purposes. So that's difficult, because I think the outside world will then say, why aren't you just opening up and saying, what the state of, these firms is? Why don't you just lay it all out so we can all see it? And you can't, of course, you can't do that, because you are dealing with a very large amount of very commercially sensitive information. So you have to strike this balance, and of course that's the challenge of getting to having trust in the system of supervision. So people say, yeah, I can let them get on with it because I sort of know what they're doing, because they've sort of explained how they do it enough. And I've got a sense they sort of know what they're doing, and you can let them get on with it, because that there has to be that trust in the system because of the sheer commercial confidentiality of it.
So which may well be the case, if the next stress in the system comes not from credit or liquidity failures, but from cyber or AI failures of some sort, suppose we were to finish this conversation and in an hour find out that had happened. What would you look at and say, oh, we should have done this to the supervisory process to address that? Is it to bring in more skills into the supervisory armada? Is it to change an approach or a focus? Is it, we're reasonably on course and there's only so much one can do?
Well, I mean, we fought the crisis on financial risk. What we have to accept is that what has happened since then is that non-financial risk has come up the league table. So I would say, and I've said quite often, that I think cyber is the thing that is. If you ask me what risk has come most rapidly up the league table in the period since the financial crisis, it's cyber. Mm-hmm. The second feature of cyber that makes it stand out is that it is the risk that you cannot remediate in any convincing sense. Not because you're not doing the right things, but because it will just move on. I always give the idea, this is true of the British Parliament. You can go into Parliament sometimes, and the MPs will say to you, "Can you assure me that this will never happen again?" And with cyber, not only can I not assure you, it's probably happened while we've been talking, because we are constantly being attacked, and the attacks are constantly moving on, and we're seeing this, of course, in the world at large at the moment. So in that sense, it has changed the game fundamentally, I think, as to what we have to do. Now, we've done a lot of those things. I mean, we do a lot of stress testing. We do so-called penetration testing of the friendly variety, by the way, but it is serious testing. Nobody likes to be rung up and told that we've been in your systems and you haven't spotted it. we have to go on doing these things, and we have to, respond and basically evolve as the threat evolves, because, we can not give that promise that we will remediate this, and it will go away. I think AI, Jon was very interesting on this. And I agree with the point you made, Jon, at the end. I think the challenge with AI is, we're all trying to use it. We must use it in a sense, because it's clearly, very important development, and it's a very important productivity tool. I think broadly, in the sort of what we used to not think were the old-fashioned sort of models, but they may be increasingly looking that way. We were able to say to firms, the test essentially that we would put on a firm as a supervisor, say, of a more old-fashioned model is, give us the assurance that you know how this thing works, and that you're controlling it. Because and of course it doesn't always work. I can remember cases where we've had trading risk models go wrong. We've had, we had a jump in the sterling exchange rate one night because somebody set the wrong stop loss limit on a model. I won't name the bank, and the thing jumped in illiquid markets. They literally just screwed up and put the wrong number in the stop loss. Human error. But they knew how the model worked. They just screwed it up. The problem, the challenge we face with AI models is I don't think we're anywhere near being able to see that, and I don't claim to be an expert on these things, but I talk to people who know a lot more about than I do, to saying we will understand how LLMs work in the same way. So the question then as a supervisor is, and the authority is, well, you can't go around and say, well, you can't use those models because you don't understand it according to the old standard. Is how do we set, sensible expectations and standards? And I think that's going to be that is a very challenging question.
So before we turn to audience questions, one last question. So from your experience, again, across the whole range of PRA, FCA, Governor, FSB, if you had to name a single institutional change that would most strengthen global bank supervision while also addressing concerns about its political legitimacy, can you name one?
Well, I'll just tell you the thing that I think I would have said 10 years ago, and I think 10 years ago, going back to what we were saying a few minutes ago, I would have said cross-border information flows and coordination. I think that has changed hugely for the better. I think the thing today, let's come back to the sort of the climate we're living in, is to say, I have no problem with debates about simplification, competitiveness and growth in the following sense. Are all of our rules and regulations perfectly formed? No, of course they're not, because the world moves on. Even if they were at one point,
right,
they're not going to remain so. So you have to keep coming back to these things, and I, absolutely accept, and the priorities change as well. But financial stability and monetary stability are what I call the foundations of which, we can finance economies, we can help growth, innovation, all that good stuff. And I think, and I wish that we could come to a better understanding of how, you sort of put those, you accept what those things mean, and then say, okay, let's have a sort of honest debate about what the best set of sort of rules to go with them is. And it's about grounding it really. And I worry because, we've been here before. I'm not saying we're back in the pre-financial crisis, because I don't think we are actually. But I always remember, Hyman Minsky, who's one of the sort of founders of financial stability theory, he wrote very wisely, the further you get away from a crisis, the more the memory fades. And I think we are seeing that at the moment, members. I think we are seeing the rearview mirror effect going on. And I think we've got, that's why people, tedious people like me keep saying, there is no trade-off with financial stability, but we have to define, we have to be clear on what financial stability is. And it is, monetary stability isn't easy, but I think it's easier sometimes than defining financial stability in that sense. This comes back to the independence point, actually.
Yes, so questions, turning to questions.
Excellent. Let's open the floor for questions. Please, again, name and affiliation.
You have overawed them all.
Gentlemen in the middle. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much, Tom Reeder at LSE. Psychology department here. I study the role of culture and psychology in accidents. And one thing I wanted to ask is, in aviation, regulation and supervision, with some exceptions, has made the industry more profitable and safer. So if you think about the system and how it works, much of it's pinned on engineering processes that come from an urge to stop accidents, but which actually have been good all round. And I wonder, is there a similar pathway for the banking sector, for supervision? So it's not just about stopping what's going wrong, but that sort of tension that you were describing earlier and other people pointed out, maybe it's not really there in certain circumstances and ways. So I just wondered if you might comment on that.
Well, it's a really fascinating question, isn't it? Because I don't spend time looking at it. I mean, I go on airlines, but I'm sorry, this is painting it overly starkly. I'm guessing in the airline industry, nobody says, you know what, if we let a few more people die every year, the industry would be in better shape and more stable. I mean, I think that would be, I would hope, as a traveller, that is not an argument that you make. I mean, I sort of, to be clear, I'm setting this up as a sort of, straw person because I think it helps. I don't think you can quite have the same debate in banking. I mean, there really is a, level of regulation versus return debate that you can have. Now, I said earlier, I think, because I think it comes from the earlier panel, I think interestingly, I think we've arrived at a point now where actually, the industry is earning at least the return it should be earning in terms of its cost of capital. And that's been a long haul from the financial crisis. I do think that's a foundation off which firms can innovate then, in a sense, and say, of course you can increase your returns, and you should do, but you can do that by innovating safely. But we're just not in that stable position. I mean, the debate around us isn't like that, whereas I sort of guess in the airline industry it isn't the same.
Yes, please.
I think a different way to frame it would be, we don't need...
Microphone, please.
I'm going to pick up on that other question. I think a different way to frame it would be, you don't need all these air traffic controllers. We haven't had hardly any plane accidents. These airplanes and airlines would be way more profitable. We could get more people around faster. The economy could grow if we could just, lighten up on the air traffic controllers. I think that's kind of,
Do people make that
more like the argument that we're having.
Do people make that argument?
Well, I'm a pilot, and there is an argument. I mean, it's actually, without wanting to make too much of this entire metaphor, but it is related to some of the things we've been talking about today, including that Stephen and Elizabeth have been talking about. There is a discussion about, wouldn't the system be safer if air traffic control were much more automated, as opposed to all of these individuals looking at screens and watching the blips, and if more of that was done by machine learning and AI. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
One last question. The lady in red.
Hi, I'm Risa. I'm actually also an LSE alum, and I actually also work at the bank. You mentioned how we need to establish this trust in the system and how we have to strike that balance between sharing commercially sensitive info and having that trust in the system. So I was just wondering, how else do you think we can establish that trust, or would we be asking the public to almost take a leap of faith?
Well, I mean, I think you can do quite a few things. First of all, obviously, you can have good governance within your own, your own authorities, and you should do. Secondly, we're all accountable to Parliament. I mean, that's important. I mean, we all have to be accountable to Parliament. We go and appear before Parliament. So that's another important, I think, part of it. Again, I think you can have transparency within limits in terms of describing the system you're running, how you're doing it, what your aggregate outcomes are. You can push there's certain areas where you can push, I think, on the individual accountability. I'm going to give you the obvious example. I remember when we did the first stress test and said we were going to publish individual results. I mean, Carolyn, you two have probably had these experiences. I mean, you get to see, you get people coming in saying that is the end of the world. If any bank fails, it's on you. I mean, that was said to me. I remember people saying to me, you do realise that if you fail a bank, this is it. If you're lucky, you'll have one bank fail. If you're unlucky, the other outcome is you bring the next financial crisis on. But we did it. We have had banks fail. We did also in the early days because we were sort of raising the standards. But that was a big move, but it was the right thing to do because it's a level of transparency that I think is important. What I don't think you can do is give a running commentary on sort of, what's going on. You wouldn't believe what. So I think that those limits. But I think you have to be, open to where can we safely provide more, and even where can we sort of, face up to some challenges in that front, and say, we can push transparency outwards.
Excellent. I think we have to stop here. We thank the speakers. Please stay on the stage while my colleague Andrea, Senior Advisor to the PRA, ex-Chairman of the EBA and the ECB Supervisory Board, will have concluding words. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thanks a lot to all of you for being here. Thank you to Randy and Andrew for being with us. Thank you to the fantastic panel. I think it has been, thank you to Stephen for triggering this discussion. So, I have to resist because I would like to make my own speech now, and it's 5 to 8, actually 2 to 8, so I need to really be very quick here. I think that, let's say, while we have been in the last years discussing a lot about financial regulation, regulatory reforms, supervisors have been shifting their attention very much on cultural issues, on governance, on drivers of behaviors, on management, on internal risk appetite and risk management, and to be honest, with mixed success. We have been very successful in, repairing the bank's balance sheets, in driving remediation in those spaces. Driving remediation in these areas has been very difficult. It is difficult because when you deal with cultural issues, when you deal with the drivers of governance, business model, you enter into the core of private autonomy, and there is by construction a tension between the supervisor and the firms, and the way in which you shape the dialogue is very, very crucial. And we have experimented with new tools. We have done a lot. Sometimes, let's say, maybe not in the right way. The IAF report criticizes supervisors for being maybe too much discretionary in some areas, having thrown too many findings at banks, have not been good in prioritizing issues, and we need to, to accept also some of these criticisms and try to think about that. So I think that I praise very much the effort that Randy is coordinating with Stephen and with many of the speakers today to try to develop a sort of common framework to move forward in this area, to achieve a common language, a common grammar between firms and supervisors on how to deal with cultural issues. I think that the key points will be to develop, a common understanding, maybe to have also shared common initiatives, private and public initiatives, trying to drive this effort. Ideally, this should be global because that's a topic that cuts across countries, and we need to, to try to build on this fact-finding effort that has been made to develop more debate on these important issues. Now, the event is organized under the aegis also of the Forum on Financial Supervision that I established with Pedro Duarte Neves under the kind aegis of the Systemic Risk Center. And I also want to make a bit of a commercial for the forum. If we need to have debates on these issues, let's say we need to find also places where to discuss them. The forum has been built to host contributions from supervisors, from academics, from industry representatives to foster debate on a number of issues. We have had, we opened up with an interview to one of the most brilliant minds on monetary and financial issues, which is Charles Goodard, who is with us today. And we have had many good contributions from a number of prominent figures, Sam Woods, Mike Su, we have had Patrick Honohan. Now I'll forget somebody for sure, but let's say my recommendation would be go on the regularly on the website of the forum, check for the contributions. The registration of this event will be posted on the forum, so you can also advise people that were not fortunate enough to be here tonight to go on the forum and watch it. And I really invite you also to send contributions and contribute to this debate. Before closing, I also want to thank very much Daphne Lowe and Anne Lowe from the Systemic Risk Center and Cameron Lawrence also from Starling for the extraordinary help that they gave in organizing this event. So thanks a lot to them, and thanks to all of you for joining us tonight, for being with us, and for continuing this debate also outside of this room. So I have to ask you also for your patience as our guests exit the room first, and that's the practice of the place. The speakers will exit first, and then we will have all the other people leaving the room. So thank you very much for being with us today, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.